Welcome to another episode of the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills we need to build healthy relationships with others. Today we're going to expand that phrase, building healthy relationships with others, to include society in general. These days we are just inundated with all kinds of information about almost any topic coming from all kinds of sources. And how we consume and respond to this information has a great deal of influence on our personal behavior, how we interact with others, and the health of our society. So we're going to do a two-part series. The first part's going to address disinformation, how that is being used in our society, how it differs from misinformation or someone's point of view, and how critical thinking skills in our second part of the series can be used to counter the influence of disinformation. So Marsha, let's start with what is disinformation?
Yeah, it'll be important to look at some definitions here, but I just wanted to tag on before we go on that the sheer volume of some of the information that we get these days encourages to kind of outsource our navigation of information because we can't consume it all individually, and sometimes we abdicate our digestion of it to other people. Right. So, disinformation. So, our Webster's dictionary defines disinformation as false information deliberately and often covertly spread in order to influence public opinion and obscure truth. So the important part of that is the intent. It's the deliberate action of creating this falsehood. As opposed to misinformation, which is not the same at all. Misinformation originates from inaccuracies, assumptions, sometimes the bias that we bring, selective listening, either gullibility or naivete, poor listening. It isn't as intended. It can be accidental through haste, partial, incomplete information, a lack of clarity, not asking questions perhaps, and then not having a full understanding of something before you retransmit it. So again, the important difference is that there's no malicious intent. There's no deliberate intention to deliver a falsehood. It happens out of not being rigorous, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Not being fully aware.
Not being fully aware or not being complete in your consumption and understanding of something before you pass it on. And both of these things can actually be affected and influenced by point of view. So point of view is just your perspective about a situation, and that can be influenced by your life experience. You're going to have a point of view. We have points of view because we want to make sense out of our lives, and we have memories, and then we act upon those memories, and sometimes we generalize about our perspectives based on very few experiences with something. It can be influenced by our age, our geography, our upbringing, our life's experiences, but it provides meaning. And this can be changed, and it's flexible if we experience other people's points of view, have new experience that replace or modify the information that we already have. But sometimes we generalize our expectations based on a few experiences. So that's kind of a quick understanding of the differences. And actually, disinformation can become misinformation if we are transmitting it, but our intention wasn't like malicious at the start.
If misinformation is carried out and then becomes, the person's motivation becomes the same as a person who is given disinformation.
So what are some examples, Tom? Just in everyday life.
Right, let's take it more on the personal level first, and then we'll work it into society in general. So let's pretend for a minute that you have been recently married and your spouse had told you that he had had a previous long-term relationship but that was it basically. And then you find out after you're married that he was married before, and not only was he married, he has a child.
Yeah.
Let's take another example. If you're a parent and you have, say, a 15-year-old teenage girl who tells you that she would like to go to her friend's house for the weekend, and you know the friend, and you know her parents, and you're very approving of that, only to find out maybe a week later that your teenage daughter was not at her girlfriend's house for the weekend. She was with her boyfriend. Another example is a work colleague who may be working on a team with you on a project, and when the boss comes around and declares how pleased he is with this project and the whole idea of it, the way it was carried out, and another member of the group takes credit for it and says she was the one who came up with the idea and who actually organized everything to make it happen. And you're sitting there thinking, how in the world could she do that? I was the one that came up with this idea, and I'm the one who created the support for this project. Another is perhaps a best friend who has always told you how she was raised in a very poor family, and that has influenced her life, the way she's looked at things. And then you find out later she actually was raised in a very affluent family in a very wealthy section of town. And finally, another example is, say you just recently purchased an electric car, and you had carefully researched a lot of this and talked with a salesman about, well, we live in a cold climate. Is the cold climate going to impact the life of the battery or the length of time that it can stay charged? And the salesman assures you no, has no impact on it whatsoever, only to find out when winter arrives and your car isn't working well, that the temperature does indeed affect the charge in the battery. So these are examples of that hit the definition of falsifying information deliberately, there's the intent part, for the purpose of influencing another person's understanding of the situation and for the purpose of obscuring the truth.
Yeah.
So what is the motive then of someone who is creating this disinformation, which can range in different things, but in general, the primary purpose or purposes for this, number one is to gain power or influence, or for money, and to have personal gain, basically, at the expense of others, and sometimes to escape accountability.
Yeah. And some of the, I mean, in those interpersonal examples, we can just say, well, they were outright flat lies, but there are kind of nuanced and very strategic techniques that sometimes people can use on a larger scale when we're looking at the larger population. And when we say deliberately creating falsehoods, that could be videos, that could be the way that a photo is cropped, altering things by using excerpts and rearranging the order of things, or just plain outright fabrication. In like information sharing. Also, playing on people's emotions. Information comes to us and it has kind of a factual or an academic aspect, but it also is carrying interests and emotions. And if you really amplify and play on nostalgia, or you play on fear, or you imply threat or loss of influence, or
things are just always, or they're getting worse.
They're getting much worse. You're deliberately exaggerating something to imply that the situation is worse than it is. It's going to trigger something like that. And we've talked in previous episodes about that limbic part of your brain when your reasoning is shut down because you are reacting to a survival on those the very basic instincts that we have. And so your reasoning is just kind of amputated at that point because you're thinking with your body and with your fear. Also, people can use discrediting and ridiculing, kind of putting people down or demeaning, and even to the point where there's something called hostile attribution bias, where if somebody is presenting an opinion that you don't agree with, instead of just talking about disagreeing with the opinion, you'll just denigrate the person. And conversely, that you just can't imagine that anything that they say will be true, and you just are dismissive of that. Something called confirmation bias as well, where it's a human tendency that we seek information to confirm what we already believe, and it's efficient. And people who are trying to transmit disinformation deliberately with malintent will use that tendency. Sometimes nowadays you can amplify this with algorithms, because when people are seeking information, they're fed what they want, because the machines want to please us and give us more of what we want. And we tend, because it's easier, to look for things that are going to say, yes, I know that that's true, and sometimes omit or disregard the things that might not coincide with what we already believe.
And could I add to that part of that phenomenon is discrediting people who are experts in a field, just making that type of knowledge insignificant, that because I know as much as they would know, or they don't know what they're talking about. So in general, we can lose our respect for people who have really studied a particular problem or issue and are familiar with it.
Right. Their credentials are no longer
honored.
Honored, yeah. And overgeneralizing, and I think this is something people even do in conversation. They'll say like all or every or never, and expanding on, there might have been a little bit of truth in something, but then you exaggerate it beyond. And that's something that people use. You could say, for instance, that like all youth are self-absorbed, and that's a sweeping exaggeration. You may have encountered a few that are, or that all environmentalists are anti-business, and so people are hooked into that as a fact instead of an exaggeration.
That's a good example too of how point of view can actually be. So your own experience may be that you have been exposed to, say, teenagers who seem to be self-absorbed, and so that colors your point of view. But then when you're talking with someone else who's had a very different experience with teenagers and shows that to you, then your view is modified.
Expand, changes. It's a reductive way. It's a way of sidestepping a complicated, nuanced conversation where there are truths in all sides to a really distilled, black and white, exaggerated, amplified situation. And it's really hard to manage that. But it is a shortcut sometimes, the way we talk with each other.
And they can further make that point, I guess, by saying, if you don't believe this, then you are not one of us.
Exactly, because identity is something that we protect. We want to be a patriot, we want to be a Vermonter, we want to be the right kind of man, we want to represent our group, and we have a desperate desire to belong. So if somebody is attaching and associating their disinformation with your sense of who you are, that can be very unsettling. And so you are forced to choose maybe your critical thinking versus the emotion that you have about being disconnected from that group. And then finally, just the sheer repetition of this disinformation sometimes can give it more weight and more credence, just because it's out there getting attention and it gets traction when it really doesn't deserve it. So those are kind of strategies that if somebody has the intention to disinform, they can use. And because they trigger us and they suck us in, we don't always stop to question and to be curious.
Right. And that's going to be a lot of our second part of our show.
Yeah.
To get into that mindset where we would begin to question some of these things, and how to do that.
Yeah.
How to have a mindset that would say, okay, that's a perspective on things, but do I really want to believe that, or is that really verifiable information?
Yeah, and the world is crazy right now because it's diverse and it's exciting and dynamic, and we have global access to all these little spots on the globe, but we don't have global context. So sometimes we can imagine that things are true, even if it seems bizarre.
And also, I think this is a legitimate response. We can get overwhelmed with contradictory information.
We are overwhelmed.
So that rather than saying, okay, let's kind of analyze this a little bit so that, yes, this contradicts that, but which one makes more sense to me in my situation?
Yeah, and we're going to get into a little bit more of that. Today is like an awareness program, and then we're going to talk about techniques. But we do need to depend. We have to delegate sometimes the consumption of information because we can't be experts in everything.
Right.
So we were brainstorming about an example of something like this, and it was really interesting to try to find something. But there was a couple of years ago a story that circulated nationwide that evidently originated in Colorado, in a school district in Colorado, actually, in sometime in 2022. And it was about outrage over the rumor that school systems were providing cat litter in bathrooms for students identifying as cats. So, on face value, a person could say, wow, that's pretty out there.
Right.
But pitted against other things that we hear that are sometimes true, they turn out to be true, you want to be open to the possibility.
Especially if we're in an era where we're hearing so many things that seem so illogical, that just don't make sense to us. Sometimes that's a fertile area for someone with disinformation to introduce something like this. Oh, do you realize kids are getting kitty litter boxes now in the bathrooms of the school? And you say, what? With it. So again, the methodology there of the person doing the disinforming is to just put the story out there. That's all they have to do. It can begin to
stir it.
Right.
Yeah. So what happened is then that was picked up because people repeat things. And a politician picked it up and who had a large following, and I think it was on a website and a newsletter, and then it got a larger following of people repeating this.
So again, using methodology, what might be the method that a politician is doing for his or her benefit would be feeding on public fear that, oh my gosh, this is going way too far now. We've got to set some standards. We've got to form the line somewhere. Right. And so this is sort of stirring the pot again, but using it for the politician's own benefit, that then they can say, I can deal with this. I will deal.
And it bolstered a point of view.
It bolstered a point of view and made people think that the answer is within this one person or within one solution to it. So it limits, again, the thinking.
Right, because there wasn't a lot of credence or even evidence offered. So what happened was then it spread from Colorado to Tennessee and to Minnesota, I think. And then ultimately, it was rumored that this was a nationwide practice in public schools. And it even was attributed to schools in Vermont.
Yeah, and again, nationally, I think it's a natural phenomenon. Our news media has to pick up on stories that people are going to be interested in and that have some, credibility, but at least have some meaning. So if they hear all this going on, it's natural for a news station to put that on, which further carries out this disinformation, even when the station itself may not have, or whatever means of transmission is being used, their intent may not be what the original person was introducing the disinformation, but it's carrying it out. It becomes carrying out misinformation.
Well, each different platform will have different standards for how they test their information. And we're going to actually talk again in the next episode about how people can kind of vet information and be curious about it. But even if it isn't elevated to that kind of level of an institution that is like a TV, if there are enough smaller, more social media, it can still go viral. It
just spreads,
and the sheer numbers of smaller individuals perpetuating this can outweigh even the omission of it being on a more rigorously vetted platform. Since this happened, and I know that people were talking about it even in Vermont and even in the Rutland area, and school staff was asked, and because it's somebody in your community asking, you want to be respectful and you want to dignify them and not put them down, but it's also it's very disarming and a little insulting that people who are educated would feel like that would be something that was happening. But the power of this mechanism of disinformation is so strong that it even makes people who would normally question susceptible to it. It's like when people are scammed. They're playing on your susceptibilities and the tendency to want to trust. So it was debunked locally. It was debunked completely nationally.
There was just no credibility, no evidence.
Rigorous journalists went to all of the school systems that were referenced in the original reports and the subsequent reports. There was like zero credibility to it. But there are still people, because of the repetition and because of the scale of the spread of the story, who still hold some shred of belief that this was happening and it was a cover-up.
And it feeds into, you can't trust these officials, what they're saying. They say they've looked into it, but I believe that they're just covering up.
And everybody feels that way about, regardless of what position you're taking on an issue, your trust is eroded because the forces are so powerful in every direction. So we're not taking a partisan position on any of these things. We're just talking about awareness of the force.
Right. Well, a disinformer also can keep doing this in an insidious way. Here's information introduced, it's false. And then when you begin to work on, well, you can't believe these people, they're lying about whether this is occurring or not, it becomes an insidious cycle.
Right. Another strategy that people use sometimes is to embed the disinformation in a question, such as like, I understand that you didn't get a permit for your solar field. How do you feel about that? What do you have to say about that? And it's, are you still beating your wife, kind of the old cliche of like, how do you refute that? You're refuting the question, you're refuting the statement. So that's also a strategy when you continue to embed that falsehood in conversation.
That is used a great deal by people reporting on something or going out and questioning to follow up on it.
Not everybody.
It's just a way of leading in with it that engages people, and that's what they want to do. They want to engage it. But it's engaging in a way that implies there's truth to the statement without allowing the person just to say whether there is
open-ended question, like tell us about this. So evidently, there was some evidence or an implication that the people who were originally spreading this story were doing it as a reaction to their discontent about identities and young people and people of all ages trying to expand the awareness and acceptance of different pronouns, gender fluidity, and things like that. And instead of engaging in a civil dialogue about the particular details of that, they kind of glommed onto this story, which exaggerated and triggered people's intense fears, anxieties, discontent, disbelief, and it encouraged this big reaction. And the consequences were that it served to mock students who were identified as non-traditional gender and roles, as well as the groups in the community that supported those people. And it undermined the public's confidence in education and educators to be allowing something like this to happen. It fed biases against the LGBTQ community and those who support it. And it just escalated the fears that people have about change and new policies. And we're not taking a position on this at all, but saying that it obscured a productive dialogue about these issues by
learning more information,
learning more, being curious, actually being solution focused and dialogue focused, because it shut reasoning down and it just inflamed and enraged people.
Another consequence, I think, of this is it splits people into factions, unfortunately, referring back to that phenomenon you were talking about and we've discussed before about the need for the human being to belong, to feel a group. So that if you're not a member of our group, you can get that feeling of being isolated. And that can compromise sometimes our allegiance to something. It distracted or can distract attention from important issues in education, while administrators, teachers are trying to chase down where did this come from and why are people believing this false information. So it can monopolize people's time with it. And finally, it can create an enduring story that for some reason just keeps going on with a life of its own, so that 5 years, 10 years from this occurring, people can say, oh, remember when kids used to do this? And you say, no, that was debunked, that was not. Yet it still has a life of its own.
So in our next episode, and we invite you to join us for our next episode, we are going to talk about strategies to help us identify and defend against disinformation, and to keep us from being misinformers by taking that disinformation and accepting it at face value and then passing it on to others. Much like we have talked in interpersonal conflict about like raising that curiosity factor, asking questions, being cautiously suspicious. Maybe suspicious is too strong, but cautiously curious.
Curious, yeah.
And looking at who's saying it, what the purpose is, who's behind it, and just testing our feelings. Because, wow, sometimes that story is true, and sometimes it's not. And to be a responsible member of society and to enhance our ability to talk about hard stuff.
And we also can know the fact that we can tolerate different points of view and still perhaps be friends or be acquaintances or work together. So we don't have to agree, and it then takes away our identity somehow if we're not in agreement with this other person.
Or short circuit our ability to think about something, even if it's something that we're passionate about. So thank you for being with us today as we look at disinformation, misinformation, and points of view, and join us next time for strategies for interceding and defending against disinformation and raising our critical thinking muscle skills.